Hi, my name's Bruce Robinson. I'm a doctor who specialises in lung diseases here in Perth, Western Australia, and also an immunologist. And I'd like to talk to you about the new drugs available in COVID. You might have seen this on the evening news. They're going to put an end to COVID. It's very exciting and very important because, of course, COVID deaths have gone past 6 million in the world. And you all know that some drugs were tried early on and we hoped they would work, like hydroxychloroquine, but it doesn't work and it causes problems in the heart, the eyes, and some metabolic problems. Ivermectin, no real evidence that it works, and other drugs that haven't worked. Now, when I talk about drugs, I really have to emphasize something. These drugs are terrific, and they're only just being used in the clinic, in the hospitals. And this is an update, this isn't any recommendation. But these new drugs have been recently, just a few months ago, recommended by the WHO and in Australia by the Minister for Health, Mr. Greg Hunt. So I'll talk about how they work, but I need to emphasise they do not replace vaccination. Vaccines are very powerful in protecting against serious disease. This is in addition to, or in our case, if we find someone who's been either unvaccinated who comes to hospital, and there is still somebody, and we're going to talk about that in a later video, or someone who is really sick and so they have an underlying illness and so they get quite sick even with what might otherwise be a mild COVID. Some of these new drugs are intravenous, most of them are oral, and one of the nice things about them is that they can be given to patients to take in their own home under the advice of a doctor, so they don't have to go to hospital to have intravenous treatment. So these drugs are not given to everybody. They're given to people who definitely have COVID and who have a serious underlying condition that makes them at risk of progressive disease. And there are two main sorts of drugs, and they deal with the two main sorts of problems that occur, for example, in the lung. The first is antivirals. These control the viral infection itself, or they slow it down. They have to be used within the first 5 days. First 5 days of getting symptoms, obviously, because that's when the virus is really starting to spread around the lower part of the lung. And I'll talk about some drugs in that category. The second group are the anti-inflammatories. And I'm going to explain now how the virus affects the lung and where these different drugs work and why one sort has to be given early in the first 5 days and the other not until the patient is in hospital. What you can see here is the deep lung. This is where oxygen goes in and carbon dioxide comes out. And this is distinct from the upper part of the lung, like the windpipe, where COVID tends to start. When it comes down and enters into the deep lung, that's when problems occur. The virus enters these cells, which are called epithelial cells, that line the lung and keep it strong and allow oxygen to come out. And this phase is called the virus infection phase. Not the inflammation phase, but the virus infection phase. So some drugs only act on this phase. And this is typically when the patient is still at home and usually has no symptoms or very mild symptoms like a cold or a flu. And there are several drugs that work in this phase, and these are the antiviral drugs, and I've named two of them there, which I'll discuss in a moment. The second phase is the inflammatory phase. That's when white cells come out of the blood vessel into the lung to fight the infection. At the same time, they release different molecules called cytokines and other molecules. So this is basically a pneumonia, and this is when you can often feel quite sick. And it's called the inflammatory phase, and you may well at this stage be on the ward and taking supplemental oxygen. So a different set of drugs are used in this phase, the inflammatory phase, because their job is to turn off the inflammation and prevent further damage, or at least to dampen down the inflammation and prevent further damage. And there's a couple of drugs, steroids and baricitinib, which are typically used. It really gets bad when these cytokines get released in large amounts, what's called a cytokine storm, and that causes damage. And there are three kind of main sorts of damage. Hyaline membranes, which are mostly proteins, widespread damage to those lung epithelial cells, which are quite vulnerable. and some clotting in the blood vessels, which you've probably heard about, which sometimes require blood thinners. But that's the stage at which the patients get really sick. It's a damage phase, and at this stage patients might often be in ICU. So they're the three stages: the virus infection stage, the inflammatory stage, and then the damage phase. And these are some of the drugs that we'll talk about that work in each of these different phases. So I'll begin by mentioning a few drugs that are antivirals and taken in those first 5 days, and in someone who's COVID positive and at risk of severe disease. The first, a monoclonal antibody, and it blocks that spike protein, famous spike protein, that causes it to stick to receptors in the lung and invade. It's been tried in over 4,000 patients and is now approved for use in anyone over the age of 12 who fits those categories: high risk of hospitalisation, pre-existing illness, and definitely COVID positive. But must be this first 5 days. It's given intravenously, so it's not a home treatment, unlike another drug, molnupiravir, which is actually approved for use in aged care. It was originally developed actually to treat influenza, but attention was switched to COVID. What it does is it causes mistakes to be made in the code that makes more copies of the virus, and that's how it stops the virus spreading. But it also causes some concerns amongst scientists because it might create more chance of new variants happening. We just don't know. Just an interesting point is the name of the drug was actually inspired by the Viking king Thor. Mjolnir. Anyway, it was about having a hammer blow to the virus delivered by the god of thunder. Anyway, the key thing is that 700 people who got this treatment, only 1 died, and 700 who didn't, 9 died. So it was felt that this was a drug that could have some benefit. The third of these drugs, and to be honest it's my favourite, is a drug called Paxlovid. It also stops the virus making more copies of itself, and it caused 90% reduction in the risk of hospitalisation when it was taken within 5 days. And I like a lot of things about this drug, apart from the fact that it works well to stop progression of disease. Secondly, it should be active in any future new variants and doesn't rely on immunology like a vaccine, because this is not an immune drug. It's a direct acting drug that stops the virus. It's also oral, so it can be taken at home in at-risk people if the doctor prescribes it. It does have some side effects of drug interactions, so you need to talk to your doctor about that. But and also it hasn't been shown yet what its benefit is in someone who's been vaccinated. Most of those studies were done in people without being vaccinated. So that information will be coming out soon. So there are 3 drugs that can be given in the first 5 days to stop inflammation. This is when you're at home. But then you go to hospital and you need to be on oxygen, and you get inflammation in the lung, or inflammation gets worse, requiring you to go to hospital. What is inflammation? Well, we all know about arthritis and skin rashes. That's inflammation. And when it happens in the deep lung, it's kind of like a pneumonia, if you like. Inflammation is normally carefully regulated in the body, as we discussed before. It's white cells that come to fight the bugs, but sometimes that inflammation causes more damage than the bugs, with that cytokine storm that I talked about. In fact, that can be lethal. So these drugs that control this storm can be administered to patients, and with or without some anticoagulation, because of the clotting problem I mentioned earlier on. They're not active against the virus, or not very strong, but they're active against the inflammation. And again, I say, unlike the antivirals, these are not given in the first 5 days. They're given afterwards, probably when you're in hospital on oxygen, that sort of thing. The whole goal is to reduce injury and organ damage. Lots of these different drugs have been tried. I'm just going to mention 3 of them, which you saw in the slides. The first are steroids, dexamethasone. Everyone knows about steroids, I think, because they either have or they've seen someone taking steroid inhalers for asthma, or they've used steroid cream on an eczema or other skin rash. Very effective, proven to be effective. The second drug, one of my favourites, is called baricitinib. This is a drug that was originally used for treating rheumatoid arthritis in adults whose disease was not well controlled. But 2 years ago, in the very early days of COVID, some very bright English scientists, including two friends of mine, Justin Stebbing and Peter Richardson, used some very complicated artificial intelligence to try to predict which drugs might be useful against COVID. They came up with baricitinib. And it's really wonderful to see that this anti-inflammatory drug, which actually does also block the virus a bit, has now been tested in thousands of patients and causes about a 40% reduction in deaths from COVID. And it's a great example of how advanced science, artificial intelligence, mining millions of bits of information, can actually come up with a drug that saves lives. In fact, it works best when given with steroids, which I mentioned before, and it has been approved by the World Health Organization. You might think about remdesivir, that got used early on. It doesn't really look all that effective compared to these other drugs, so we don't use it a great deal. And so steroids and baricitinib are standard of care now for my patients and my colleagues' patients down in the hospital down the road. It is important for me to repeat that this is just an update and an explanation. It's not a recommendation. All decisions must be made in consultation with your healthcare professionals, your doctor. In subsequent videos, we will address any questions you might have if you want to email them into us. And here's the email. Thanks for listening. We look forward to talking to you again. And just remember, we can send you information and also answers to questions in these videos in your own language, if you just let us know. Thanks. Bye.